Namaste, everyone. Namaste, friends, and welcome to our satsang this morning. This is one of the unusual periods in our calendar for the fact that so many of our religious traditions have sacred occasions that they are celebrating. This is the weekend of Easter for Christians. We recently celebrated Hanuman Jayanti for the Jains. It's Mahavir Jayanti. Our Jewish friends are celebrating Passover. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are observing the fast of Ramadan, and among others, other holy days that are happening. Yes, Hanuman Jayanti, of course, for the Hindu community, and Mahavir Jayanti for the Jains. So let us begin as we do with the Shanti mantras, a few of the Shanti mantras from the Upanishads. Om Bhadram Karnebhi Srunuyam Devaha Bhadram Pashyamakshyabhiryajatraha Stirair Angair Tushtuvagum Sastunubhi Vyashema Devahitam Yadayuhu Swastina Indro Vridhasravaha Swastina Pusha Vishwavedaha Swastir Nakshtaksho Arishtanemihi Swastino Brihaspatir Dadhatu Om Shanti 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 Om Shanno Mitra Shamvarunaha Shanno Bhavatvaryama Shanna Indro Brihaspatihi Shanno Vishnurukramaha Namo Brahmane Namaste Vayo Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahmasi Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahma Vadishyami Ritam Vadishyami Satyam Vadishyami Tanmamavatu Tadvaktaram Avatu Avatu Mam Avatu Vaktaram Om Shanti 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 Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So once again, welcome to Satsang this morning, wherever you're joining us from, here in Minnesota, other parts of the United States, Florida, New York, and of course, those of you who are joining from abroad. Welcome. It's good to be with all of you this morning. Today, I will continue the discussions that we've been having on portions of the Upanishad dialogues. This, in fact, is the sixth satsang, the sixth discussion on this theme, the theme of wisdom teachings from the Upanishads. We studied so far the conversation between Maitreyi and Yajnavalkya from Bruhadaranyak Upanishad, where we focus there on wealth, its importance, its necessity, but also its limits. We also discussed the conversation from Chandogya Upanishad between Narada and his teacher, Sanat Kumara. And there we discuss the limits of knowledge, as you will recall, the great learned scholar Narada suddenly discovered that in spite of all of his learning, he was experiencing a very deep and profound sorrow that had no solution, but the teaching that his brother Sanat Kumara offered to him about the nature of Atman. We also looked at again also a Chandogya Upanishad dialogue between Aruni, the teacher, and his son Shvetaketu. And I focused there on the very powerful example of the seed from the banyan tree, where Aruni asked his son to break the seed into its finer and finer portions until Shvetaketu could not see anything. And then his father, his guru, explained to him that that which you say you cannot see, that is the source of this great banyan tree. That is the truth. That is the reality of all things. So the main teaching that I lifted up from that example, from that metaphor, is Brahman as the ground, as the foundation, the reality of everything that exists, the tiny seed, the universe, you and I. And then we looked at another Bruhadaranyak Upanishad dialogue, this one where the different organs of the body were competing among themselves about who is the greatest, who is the most important, who is the one without which no other organs will survive. And we spoke of this, or the text speaks of this as prana. And we discussed prana in all of its different manifestations, all of its different expressions. But we also understand that Brahman is pranasya prana, that Brahman is also that because of which the prana itself, the various energies in the body function, without which there is no functioning, there are no physiological expressions of life. And then we last week, we looked at one related discussion, but this time from Kena Upanishad, where we encountered the Devas, Agni, Vayu, and Indra, who were all suffering from the defect of arrogance, ahankara, thinking that they did everything that they did independent of the divine, independent of Brahman. So they had to learn the lesson that everything they accomplished was made possible only because of Brahman. We discussed there that pride in one's accomplishment is important. It is necessary, but pride is different from ahankara. It is different from arrogance. It is correct to have a sense of pride in one's accomplishment, but one should always celebrate one's accomplishment with gratitude and with a recognition of all that one has received from others who make one's own success possible. And that, of course, includes the one divine. So this morning, I want to discuss with you a conversation, this time going back to Bruhadaranyak Upanishad and chapter 5. Many years ago, I remember discussing this conversation, but many of you were not there with us in satsangs. But since I am doing this series of lectures from the Upanishads, I thought I would like to return to this one again. Every time, of course, we study and we discuss a text, we see new things. It continues to be relevant to us. And this is the beauty of Shastras. This is the beauty of Sruti, that these teachings continue to speak to us in new ways, in relevant ways across the ages. So in chapter 5 of Bruhadaranyak Upanishad, we encounter a teacher. Of course, we've encountered teachers in many of the conversations we have been studying, but here we encounter a teacher, and his name is Prajapati. And Prajapati has, we are told in this conversation, he has, as his students, 3 types. And they are described as the Devas are studying with him. We spoke last week about Devas, the word Deva coming from Dev, which means a divine beings. And then secondly, he had with him human beings, Manushya. And thirdly, he had with him what the text calls the Asuras. Let's for the moment speak of these as demonic beings. So they all studied with Prajapati. The Devas we may think of as beings who have a predominance of virtue, those in whom virtue predominate, but they are not perfect. The Asuras are those in whom negative tendencies predominate, but they also have certain virtues or virtuous tendencies. And Manushyas or human beings, those in whom there is a measure of balance between positive and negative tendencies. So I prefer, when I read this text, to think of these as 3 different types of human beings who are studying with their teacher. Devas, Asuras, Manushyas, 3 human types. So they lived with Prajapati for many years, we are told in the text. And after completing their studies, the Devas, the divine beings, approached him. So we can use our imagination here. Perhaps this conversation is occurring shortly before graduation or commencement, but it clearly appears that they are coming to the end of their studies, or they have ended the period of their studentship with Prajapati. So the Devas approach Prajapati first and asks him or requests from him, Bravitu no Bhavaniti, please teach us, they ask. Please teach us. And Prajapati responded, yes. And he gave them the single Sanskrit syllable, da. He doesn't answer the question directly, but he says, when they say to him, please teach us, he responds by uttering the Sanskrit syllable da and asking them to reflect on it. Think about it. And so the Devas reflect on what the teacher Prajapati said, and they come back to him, and he asked, have you understood? And they said, yes, we understand what you say. You tell us, Damyata. Da starts with da. You mean, you are telling us, Damyateti. You are telling us, Dhamma. Control yourselves. You said to us, practice self-control, Dhamma. And he said, yes, you have understood. Next, the human beings, Manushya, came to Prajapati with the same request. Please teach us. And Prajapati repeated the syllable, da, tatha da, and asked, "Have you understood?" And they also, after reflection, said, "Yes, we understand. You said to us, datta, datta, give, be generous, share." So the devas heard Dhamma, the Manushyas heard datta, and then finally it was the turn of the Asuras to make the same request of Prajapati. So they also asked for a teaching, and as you would have anticipated, if this is the first time you are hearing this text, Prajapati also said to them, ask, "Have you understood?" They reflected, they came back, and they said, "Yes, we understand. You said to us, Dayadvam, Daya, be compassionate, be compassionate, Dayadvam." So Devas heard Dhamma, control yourselves. Human beings heard Datta, give, be generous, share. Asuras heard Daya, the same syllable Da, they heard in these three ways. That is the gist of this encounter. It's brief, but it's very profound. So let us reflect for a few moments on this Upanishadic encounter. Let us begin by noting the context in which this conversation is taking place, the nature of the questions and the context in which it is occurring. So all three groups of students, Devas, Manushyas, Asuras, had studied for many years with Prajapati. Traditionally, the length of time for Vedic studies, as we assume they were, was 12 years. So we can assume, as I said at the beginning, they spent 12 years studying with him. They have arrived now at their commencement occasion, and they are requesting further instruction. Please teach us. But the request that each group makes of Prajapati was not motivated by the thought that Prajapati had omitted something important during their course of studies with him. So when they come and they each ask, "Please teach us," we should not understand these students as implying, "Dear teacher, our teaching is incomplete. You left something out that is important. Please complete the teaching." We should understand the question as a desire, as a wish on the part of these students after 12 years of study to receive from their revered teacher a final word before they leave his ashram. You know, at St. Olaf College, we also have a tradition. It is called the last lecture. And the last lecture occurs after 4 years of study. And the students, the procedure is interesting. The graduating class votes and selects one of their professors to give them the last lecture. And they all gather for this last lecture. In that sense, they're looking to this professor for a final teaching that, in some sense, in one way or the other, crystallizes their 4 years of study, something profound that they will now take back with them as they return to their homes, or they continue studying, or they begin professions. So please give us your final teaching. This is the context, I think, in which we have to understand this question. This is very important. So in such a context, a teacher is likely to give what he regards or what she regards as the essence of all that he or she had taught before, and what he or she regards as most essential for his or her students to remember, and to do it in a way that they will not forget. And this is one of the beautiful things about this teaching, the skillful nature in which Prajapati instructs. As we study these Upanishad dialogues, I hope that you're also seeing, paying attention to the skillful methods that are there in these texts for instruction. As we say, the pedagogy of the Upanishads, not only the content, but the methods that teachers are using to teach. So what would I say, for example, if I had to summarize, a course that I taught over the entire semester? What would be my final teaching? Now, a traditional course of Vedic studies in an ashram, in an ancient ashram in India, consisted of certain disciplines. These were called Shadangas, the 6 limbs of Vedic study. This is what these students would have spent their 12 years studying. One is phonetics, Siksha, the science of right pronunciation of mantras, Siksha. Then they would have studied with him Kalpa. So the first one, Siksha, how to recite mantras properly. Kalpa, how to perform rituals properly. The third is Vyakarana. They would have studied grammar, Sanskrit grammar, Panini, for example. They would have studied, fourthly, Nirukta. There are certain books, certain manuals that explain the root meanings of words. So this is called Niruktam. They would have studied Chandas or Chanda, the various meters in which Vedic verses are composed. And finally, they would study Jyotisha, astronomy, astrology, because of which they would know, understand the Hindu ritual calendar, the proper time for performing samskaras and other rituals. So Siksha, Kalpa, Vyakarana, Nirukta, Chanda, Jyotisha. These are the 6 angas, the 6 limbs of Vedic study. So now they've come to the end of their study and they've asked their teacher, please teach us. I find it very profound and very insightful that Prajapati, in his final word to them, does not go back to any of these angas, these 6 angas. He doesn't say, please remember to pronounce your mantras properly. Please perform your rituals in the right sequence, in the right time. Practice your Vedic mantras so that your meters of chanting would be always with you. All of these are important. They studied for 12 years. But when they ask him for a final teaching, he does not speak about these things. He does not even speak of what we may regard today as philosophy or theology or doctrine. He speaks to them, please notice this, he speaks to them of ethics. Three profound humane values: control, give, compassion. Dhamma, datta, and daya. Prajapati's students are not going to live in forests, in isolation. They are not renunciants, sannyasins, monks. They are going back to living in communities, in relationships with others. They are not withdrawing from society. So he imparts to them these three, what I would describe as these three relational values. These are all values that are to be practiced in relationships with other human beings or other living beings. This is what he wants them to remember. In other words, he's saying to them that all that you have studied with me, all the 6 angas of the Vedas that you have studied with me, is finds its fulfillment, finds its culmination in a certain ethical way of being in the world, a certain moral way of being in the world that is characterized by Dhamma, Datta, Daya, control, generosity, and compassion. And he's saying that you have not really understood me or understood my teachings unless you understand these values. These values are the fruits of all that we have studied. So let us turn now. So I have described for you the encounter between Prajapati and his 3 types of students. I try to give you a sense of how I see the context in which this discussion is occurring. So let us now turn for a brief word on each of these values. That's the 3rd part of my talk this morning. Why does Prajapati emphasize these 3 fundamental values? Beginning with Dhamma. As we saw, the Devas were the first to come, and he gave them Da, and they said, we hear you saying Dhamma. Control yourselves. So self-control is a uniquely human value. It is the ability to change one's behavior, to modify one's conduct, to make choices in life, to alter behavior because of careful reflection about consequences, especially to restrain oneself and to change one's choices if the consequences of a particular choice are, or if a particular choice results in suffering to others. It is the capacity to think of the consequences of one's action, especially in relation to others. This is why I say it's a relational value. The restraint, practicing restraint, if my choices cause pain to others, cause suffering to others. It's something that is It presupposes freedom of choice, something that is special and unique to us as human beings. Self-control is neither necessary or possible for other species of being, since freedom of choice is either absent or perhaps even minimal. But behavior is regulated by biological instincts. We also have biological needs and drives, but in addition to that, what makes us uniquely human is our ability to control these. And here, to control these in order to limit suffering upon others. We are capable of considering the consequences of actions before embarking on such actions. So this is the gist of this practice of self-control. So we practice self-control when, because of consideration for the needs and feelings of others, we choose thoughts, words, and actions that do not cause suffering. Right? And to others or to oneself. To others or to oneself. Today, I think it is important that when we think of these three values that we're discussing today, control, generosity, compassion, while I am saying that they are relational or interpersonal values, I think and this is why these conversations continue to speak to us. I think it is appropriate and it is necessary that we extend the meaning of self-control, for example, to how we are using the resources of our world. Are we practicing control as far as the resources of the earth are concerned? Because we are seeing how quickly we are depleting these resources, and we are seeing the consequences of wrong choices. When I entered the conversation today, I just overheard a discussion that some of you were having about drought in California and water restrictions. To what extent this is the consequence of human beings as a species not exercising control. And now we are reaping the results in climate change. So self-control speaks not only to the way in which we relate to one another, but we can extend it to thinking today about our utilization of global, the resources of the earth. What about self-control and corporations? What about the desire for profit as the sole motive that drives corporations without thinking of the consequences of what they do? Today, corporations have budgets that are, in so many cases, larger than the budgets of nations. And so the choices that corporations make have an impact on the globe. And if a corporation is motivated only by profit making without thinking of the broader consequences for the common good, then the consequences are disastrous. So, I think it's so important that as we retrieve these Upanishadic values, we see also how important they are in this broader context, and not only in how you and I relate to each other. We have to extend this discussion on self-control and ask, what does self-control mean in a social context? How do we make choices that are conducive to the common good? The Devas are generally considered to be virtuous beings, but clearly, the text is is advocating self-control for them, because we have so many examples where virtuous people don't often think of the consequences of actions that they make. So after the divine beings, as we have seen, received Prajapati's answer, he assured them, yes, you understood correctly. And then the human beings came, and they heard the syllable da, and they said, Reverend teacher, you told us that we must give, we must be generous, we must share. And he said, you understand. Again, I invite all of you to think of these values, and also how do these values relate to each other, the interrelatedness of the three values. And I think I just want to make one observation on this, an important reason why I think datta or generosity follows dhamma or self-control, because it is quite possible to interpret dhamma or self-control in a negative way. We may take it to mean that we must abstain from thoughts and words and actions that cause suffering to others. So if we understand Dhamma in this way, when understood in this way, self-control as a value does not motivate me to undertake actions to relieve suffering, as long as I feel that I am not the cause of suffering. You follow me? As long as I think that I'm not the cause of suffering, I'm not motivated to do anything to relieve suffering or to actively promote the flourishing or the well-being of others. So it is conceivable that we could speak about practicing self-control and yet be quite indifferent to the suffering of others, as long as we believe that we are not the agents of such suffering. So self-control as a virtue can unfortunately be very self-centered, can justify a spirituality of selfishness, a privatized spirituality or a privatized religion. So it has to be complemented, as we see in this Upanishadic dialogue, by the emphasis on generosity, giving. Self-control is by itself incomplete unless it is followed and complemented by generosity, sharing, giving. This is one of the reasons why, Mahatma Gandhi saw the danger in the word ahimsa, because it's a negative word, ahimsa, not hurting. And he said, someone might think that I fulfill ahimsa simply if I don't hurt others. But he said that ahimsa, even though a negative word, was full of positive meaning. So like two sides of a coin. One side of it is not causing pain to others. The other side of it is loving, giving, caring, sharing. He made that point very, very clearly and very strongly every time he wrote or spoke about the meaning of ahimsa. So here we see datta followed by dhamma. So although it is important that human beings live in ways that minimize pain and suffering, it is also important that our religious practice has a positive side. And the positive side of religious practice is datta, or giving. In other words, we are called upon in this conversation not only to avoid being agents of suffering, but to actively promote the well-being of others in whatever ways we can. You may recognize, the word, the root da, which gets us to both dhamma and datta, is also the word that gets us to dhanam. Da, very important syllable. Dhanam also calls from da, which it means to give. It's a virtue very highly commended in our tradition. Dhanam is different from dakshina. Dakshina is the gift. that is given in the context of a religious ritual. So the priest performs a religious ritual for you, and then you give the priest a gift, and that is called dakshina. Danam is defined as bahirvedischa tat diyate iti danam. That which is given outside of the context of a religious ritual is called danam. Danam and dakshina, ways of giving, but in different contexts. So, danam is a daily obligation of human life. And we have so much discussion, in our tradition about the right conditions for practicing datta or dana. I mean, one of the Upanishads, there is such a beautiful discussion of the ways of right giving. Maybe at some other time we can look at that in detail. Sraddhaya deyam, give with faith, give with a sense of gratitude, give as an act of worship. Sraddhaya deyam, sriya deyam, give according to your means, do not be miserly. Hriya deyam, give with humility. Bhiya deyam, give with love. Samvida deyam, give with a friendly attitude. Do not demean the recipient of your gift. So a lot of thoughtfulness is invested in thinking about giving in the Hindu tradition. And of course, the last, as we sought to approach the revered Guru Prajapati for teaching, were the Asuras. And after he repeated the to them, they came back and said, Revered teacher, we understand. You told us daya, that we must be compassionate. We must practice compassion. Dhamma, control. Datta, generosity. Daya, compassion. You may have your own thoughts about the sequence and the interrelatedness. This is what I'm inviting you to think about. But as I read these three, I see daya, or compassion, as what I will call a virtue of the heart, hridaya, a heart virtue. Daya has to do with the transformation of the human heart. One could give without daya. One may even practice self-control without daya. But one cannot, daya is what transforms the heart. And we have very beautiful definitions of daya in our Hindu tradition that I think are universal definitions. I call them definitions in the Hindu tradition, but I see all of these as human values, as human transformational values. In the Bhagavad Gita, there is this important verse where Sri Krishna says, who is the greatest of yogis? Who is the greatest yogi? We have so many different images in our minds when we think of what yoga is. And these are not wrong. There are many ways in which yoga is understood and practiced. But in Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, Atma upamyena sarvatra sukham va yadi va dukham sa yogi paramo mataha. This, he says, in my vision, is the best of yogis. One who feels, identifies with others. Sukham va yadi va dukham, atma upamyena. One who identifies with others in their joys and in their suffering. It is what another great teacher, says, para dukha dukha, sukha sukha. This is daya. Para dukha dukha, sukha sukha, what Sri Krishna says, Atma upamena, regarding the joy of another as your joy, Atma upamena, regarding the dukkha of another as your dukkha. This is a heart that is full of daya, the compassionate heart. This is the nature of the compassionate heart. And perhaps in this conversation, daya is mentioned at the end, because daya is the ground for Dhamma and Datta. Daya is where we grow, where we are growing. Daya is the expansion of the heart. Daya is the heart of the Mahatma. Mahan Atma. The word Mahatma is Mahan Atma, one whose heart is big enough to care for all, to be considerate for all, is Mahatma. So the highest motive for self-control, for generosity, is daya. Daya breaks down the walls of self-centeredness, ensures that we can hold concern for others at the center of our lives. So this encounter from the Upanishads speaks to us today, and I'm about to conclude. If we understand, as I said at the beginning, the divine and the demonic beings, devas and asuras, as different human types. The devas are those among us who are endowed. They are good beings, endowed with noble qualities of heart and head, but who lack self-control. The demonic beings are those who indulge in acts of cruelty and violence, but they are also studying, so they have the potential for virtue. But they need to cultivate daya. And as human beings, we tend to be selfish. So we need to learn what it means to give, to practice datta. No one is condemned in this narrative. I think that's why the asuras are included. The Hindu tradition looks favorably at the potential of every human being for growth, for transformation, for change. No one is condemned. There is hope in this narrative for everyone if we engage in the work of cultivating these ethical virtues. One of the most beautiful features of this Upanishad narrative, and I say so as a teacher, is that, and I hope you see this also, and we learn from this fact as well, that Prajapati, when each of his students came in groups to him to ask him for a teaching, it was very easy for him to say to the devas, Dhamma, give them the answer. And to say to the asuras, daya, and to say to the human beings, datta. But he doesn't do that. And that's the beauty of a great teacher. He gives them a syllable, the same syllable, da, to each group. And he says, you go and think about it. You think about it. Why do you think Prajapati employed that pedagogical, that device, that method of teaching? He wanted his students to discover for themselves what they needed. And what they answered, Dhamma, Datta, Daya, is what they saw themselves as need. And he wanted them to, in other words, to learn to look at themselves. Learn to look at themselves. So the Devas knew that they lacked self-control. So they heard. They were honest. They practiced a sort of an introspective honesty. And they said, yes, we are subject to carelessness in our choice of actions. We are not often concerned enough about the implications of our actions for others. So our teacher is telling us, practice control. The Asuras reflected and said, yes, we can sometimes be cruel and violent and not care about others. So they heard Daya. And the human beings reflected and said, yes, we are often selfish. We think of ourselves only. And they heard Datta. So they were able to understand and benefit from the words of their beloved teacher, because each one approached the teacher with a humble sense of what they needed to know. And in this way, because of this, because they themselves discovered it, and it didn't come from on high from the teacher, he allowed them a wonderful method of self discovery, which made the teaching more meaningful to them. And so, what do we need to learn? This is a question that I think this encounter leaves with us. What do we need to learn from for our growth? What virtue is of paramount importance to us as human beings? If we are honest with ourselves, if we introspect carefully, what does the mean for us? What is the that we must learn? Finally, I mentioned briefly the great Nobel Prize Irish writer, T.S. Eliot. I said this is a universal text. These are universal humane values. One of his most famous poems, The Wasteland, it's a very depressing poem, but in a way, he saw clearly where human civilization was going, and the devastation that lies ahead for us. He describes the earth as becoming a wasteland. That's the title of the poem, A Wasteland. But he didn't end, even though the poem is very pessimistic in its imagery, it doesn't end in pessimism. But he lifts up the fact that we still have a choice. We can save ourselves. We can save our earth. And he ends that beautiful poem by turning to this narrative that I shared with you today. And T.S. Eliot commended these values: control, give, compassion, as the most fundamental values necessary for human beings to save ourselves and to save the planet on which we live. That's how his poem ended, and that's where I end our discussion today. In fact, as an aside, the text also mentions that we should not forget these three virtues. Every time we listen to the thunder, this is what the thunder is telling us. Da, da, da. Dhamma, Tatta, Daya. Don't forget these. Hear the call to these virtues even in the sounds of nature. So thank you very much. I'll pause. We have 3 or 4 minutes in case you have any thoughts or comments or questions.
Anant, this is Shashi here.
Shashi, yes. Please
well,
go.
I enjoyed it very much. Remember that beautiful story that you told. Before I say anything about today's lecture, I just wanted to congratulate you for being recognized as one of the most important 22 people for interfaith dialogue. So congratulations for that.
Thank you, Shashi.
So that's wonderful.
Thank you.
I think as far as today's discussion is concerned, I thought even though he's talking to the suras and asuras and manavas, you can look at it as all the qualities that we all have, sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. So he is trying to bring out the best values to be brought together to ultimately reach. Because even though you want shama, damyata, only one desire you do not want to control, and that is an intense desire to be liberated. So that should not be controlled.
Yes.
The second thing is talking about greediness of the human beings. And it is important that he emphasized rightly that we should not forget the giving and not get overly controlled by the greed.
Yes.
And every once in a while, we have the tamasic tendencies where we tend to be violent. Yes. And I think he's reminding us that don't go overboard, but make sure that you're compassionate. It's a very powerful story. And I like the way you described it, how a good teacher does not give the answer right away, but says, okay, good, I'm glad you asked that question.
Yes.
Why don't you think about it? And gives us just a little hint. Because what happens is when a student is thinking himself, he comes up with sometimes better answers than even the teacher can think about. For example, I'll give one example and stop. During the camp, if you remember, I would ask them to read an essay at the end of the session for about only 2-minute essay, and ask them what they learned from that essay. And I had come prepared with about 10 points I wanted to get across to them through that essay. And whatever good point they raised, I would write down the blackboard behind. And I realized that at the end of the session, when they finished discussion, they'd come up in 10 points, but 3 or 4 of them that I had not even thought about. Mm-hmm. The students were teaching me. Of course, we completed the dialogue by adding 2, 3 more things for them. But by making the students to think about, I think they sometimes teach the teacher as well. So it's kind of very interesting that he did not give them the complete answers, but inspired them to think about themselves and then come back. So
that's a very true and very important point, Shashi. I mean, both of your points enrich our discussion, and we see it very clearly in this discussion. But it's I would say it's an Upanishadic method in so many of the other. Even when we studied Shwetaketu, his father said, what do you see? What do you see? What do you see? He's interrogating him to help him, as you said, make the discovery for himself, to make it his own. When the student discovers, it becomes the student's own. I think we have a lot to learn about teaching from these dialogues. Thank you, Shashi, for your contribution as always. Other thoughts or comments today on this dialogue and what it means to you and what you see in it and what you might want to share?
This is Arvind. Yes. I thank you for such a beautifully explaining the scriptures, which are so deep. And the 3 Ds, 3 Daya, it's very interesting that in English they translate into 3 Cs, control, compassion, and charity.
Yes.
So it is, so the even if you translate into other language, you can see the interesting depth. And I like the, of course, the way you summarize, but also I like Dr. Sane's point that the is ultimate, because these are positive virtues, but we also need to seek the truth, because once we seek the truth, and that is why those students are there.
Yes.
And when you're seeking, you will keep getting these knowledge. So is the ultimate the sense is to keep seeking the ultimate truth that we are all here for.
Yes.
What would you think about that?
No, I agree with you. They came to him to seek as truth seekers, Arvindji, and as I said, he's saying to them by commending these three values that ultimately what you have learned from me here in living with me for 12 years, what it means to you is how you treat others when you go out there in the world. Are you a caring person? Do you practice compassion? Are you a generous person? Do you give? And do you consider the consequences of your action and implications for others? In other words, what kind of life in relationship you live? This is, for this teacher, this is what it means. This is at the core, the heart of what it means to be religious, how we relate and how we treat other living beings. I would say not only other human beings, because he doesn't limit the only to the human world. It's not anthropocentric, but to all living beings. In the larger, as you said, Arvindji, in the larger pursuit of truth.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that what maybe I would treat this as a litmus test, that unless I exhibit these three values and virtues, I may not be really making progress in my pursuit of truth. No matter how I pursue it, I need to exhibit these three virtues to be really knowing that, yes, if I show control, if I show that, and if I show giving, generosity, that means I am on the right track.
Yes. Arjunji, that's well put. These are the signposts, if you want to put it in that way. These are the signposts by which we can also measure if our path, as you say, is the right path.
And I think your point about students discovering for themselves the answers by self-reflection is very appropriate, because in my own teaching career, I used to assign a problem to a PhD student and said, why don't you think about and come and tell me how you approach the problem and what your solution might be. When the student came back after about 2 or 3 weeks and explained to me, then I would pull out a paper and say, very good, what you have discovered is already been published. And so the student said, my God, I have self-confidence in myself. Yes. Now I can, you give me a problem, I know how to analyze it, and I am not scared anymore. And yes, that is the beauty of the student thinking for himself or herself, builds tremendous self-confidence in them.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You've added a new dimension to the value of this method, that it builds confidence in the students when you allow them to find the answers for themselves. But Prasannaji and Shashi, something that I think both of you I hear you saying, and it's very clear when you spoke, Shashi, that as teachers, as a teacher myself, for 36 years at the college, the times when I learned from my students, and this is what makes teaching also very exciting, is that not simply that you have something to give, but you're also receiving from your students all the time, is those times in the classroom, as you said, Shashi, when you didn't give an answer, but you sought their answers. When you sought their answers, sometimes their answers surprised you.
Yes.
and they reveal dimensions of that you didn't think about. And you learned, and you came away from that classroom as a student yourself. You know, some of the best moments, you know, we experience as teachers is when we come out of a classroom as students, and we learn from our students by trusting them, as Prasanna said, by trusting them and giving the problem over to them.
The best teacher is a patient student.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question. So there are 6 things that you went through. Some of them are quite intense, like astronomy and astrology.
Yes.
But comparatively in today's world, it just takes you up to high school and maybe a couple of years of college or something. After further studies, it is really the human being that you become and how you navigate the world. So,
yes.
But I was just very interested in what is it that I am so glad you reviewed all the things that take 12 years to study in those days. And we're still at 12 here. In modern time.
Yes,
so anyway.
That's a very good point, Naina. It was quite an intensive syllabus that they followed in the Vedic times, and you know, in another. What is also very beautiful in the Upanishads is that, you know, this is one example of a commencement encounter between students and their teachers. But we have many beautiful commencement moments in the Vedas. You know, in Taittiriya Upanishad, there is also a commencement, a much longer commencement address. But where the teacher also tells them, you know, repeatedly that Swadhyaya pravachana bhyam na pramaritavyam. And not only have you studied with me, but I want you to continue your own study. Swadhyaya. Please never stop studying. Please never stop learning, he says to them. You know, today we talk about lifelong learning as a virtue that we must all pursue. But the teacher repeated this in Taittiriya Upanishad. Swadhyaya pravachana bhyam na pramaritavyam. Not only must you continue lifelong study, but sharing your knowledge. Pravachana bhyam na pramaritavyam. Do not be forgetful. Do not be indolent about self-study and teaching. But I like the expression that you used, and I may just lift it up and underline it, that ultimately study and learning aims or finds its fulfillment in the kind of beings that we become. That's what you said. Mm-hmm. And that's, I agree with you, and that's really a profound truth. That's where the, as we say, that's where the rubber meets the road. If I use a more colloquial expression, you said that beautifully. Tested in the kind of beings that we become, and the teacher is very clear about the kind of being he wants his students to become. Beings who are imbued with Dhamma, Datta, and Daya.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few things. When I was listening to your lecture, I actually was debating whether to say this or no. It is when you said that, you know, about compassion, to identify with the joys and sorrows of others. It brought to me a very personal experience, actually. It's a bit hard for me to say this, but in 1999, I lost my brother, who was 2 years younger to me, who took his own life, actually, at the age of 31. And the aftermath of such events, we tend to identify with our loved ones. And it was very subconscious that I was going through this very, very hard sufferings. And it was like a learning lesson for me when I confided about this with my gynecologist, actually. And she picked up the phone and spoke to her friend psychiatrist. And it is sort of interesting from the point of psychiatry that we tend to identify, when you use that word identify, with other people's joys and sorrows, in some sense, it is not a very healthy word to use. Empathize is the word. You empathize with other people's sorrows and joys. But when you start identifying, it kind of, it's a hurtful thing. Joys are okay, but sorrows, they become a very hurtful and not very healthy thing to do when you, I hope you understand what I'm saying. But so, I have learned with my patients too, they come with similar circumstances, and I have to wake them up from this, that you are identifying with your mother who is suffering from cancer, or your, lost one who went through this. We really see that happening. And that's something that they should be awakened from not doing, So we have to separate the fact that we should empathize with somebody who is suffering, and we should rejoice in their joy, but it's not us who is going through that. So that distinction, I think, needs to be emphasized when we talk about these things. The second point, it's a little less heavy to talk about, was when you talked about the profits of corporations. I have come across this, that Manusmriti actually gives a definition of 15%, no more than 15% profit for the Vaishyas. And, all these ancient books have delineated, but somewhere along the line we have totally overlooked those moderation issues and all with such things. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, Madhavi. I certainly agree with you. We could, I think when I spoke about identify, I was getting to the similar point that you were making by using the word empathy or empathizing with. So, basically where we would both agree is that, it's a growth in the human heart when we are able to know what it means when another person suffers. That when someone is suffering, we can somehow put ourselves in the shoes of the others, and to say, however we call it, empathy, or I use the word identifying, but I think I mean exactly what you are saying, that if my heart is not capable in some ways of at least imaginatively knowing what that suffering is, I am not motivated to do something to help. So the point of empathy doesn't stop with empathy. It stops with the willingness to want to do something as best as I can to lift that person out of his or her suffering. But the precondition for it is at least my heart reaching out in some form of connectedness with the others, but not. And I think this is the point, if I misunderstand you, this is the point that you are making, but not in such a way that I also become incapable of helping the other. Yeah, not a passive, it's not a passive virtue, but an active virtue. Daya is an active virtue, and this is what we are speaking. But I think if you, as you call attention to what is the appropriate way of speaking about it, whether identifying or empathizing, I think your point is certainly well taken and well made. Thank you for that, Madhavi.
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Please, Bharatji.
It kind of relates to the world we have right now. When you talk about Asura, I think of Putin, and I think of what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on with the way the Biden and the European countries and others who have joined along to help Ukraine. but it's almost like we are helping, like in a sideshow. That's the theater that's going on. We kind of help them by giving them stuff, but we are all bystanders. And my question is, under these circumstances that we are living every day, when we watch TV or hear the news about what's going on, how would the 3Ds, or in English, the 3Cs, can be employed to each of these players here? So we really can get away from this horror movie in life that's being felt and experienced right in front of our eyes. That's all. I mean, I appreciated you extended the 3Ds to care for the earth, care for our planet, care for humanity. And I would just like to see how we would explore this question. Love to hear your thoughts.
It's an excellent question that you raise, and asking, how do we connect these fundamental humane values of self-control, generosity, and compassion in a context of war, as we're experiencing in so many tragic ways today. I guess the easy answer is to say I wish President Putin had practiced, but that's not that he could exercise self-control and compassion for the tragic human consequences of what his choices are causing. But so many are trying without success. So I think, the difficulty, Bharatji, is that we are witnessing, as you quite rightly indicated, unfortunately, a certain helplessness in our world in the face of this tragedy. The limitations of international organizations, including the United Nations, to be able to stop a major human tragedy. In some ways, Bharatji, we are seeing, at least on the part of other countries, the expression of daya and datta, especially in neighboring countries, however critical we might be, but in their willingness to open their borders and to open their resources to the millions of people who are coming across into the countries. In Poland, over 2 million people. Surely, these are tremendous manifestations of compassion and generosity. But how do we stop someone who is bereft of their, who is inconsiderate of that, surely lacking in Dhamma, who puts what he considers to be the priorities of his nation above human well-being, above human life itself. It's a question for the international community. Your question is a question for the international community. Has found itself in a deep predicament. I am afraid, Bharatji, I don't have an easy answer to that question. I worry that what has happened there is going to become a precedent for other such adventures in the years to come. It's a question for a world community that you ask.
Well, to me, I understand. I'm quite active in the United Nations Association for many years. And we have realized that there's been a fundamental structural problem in the way UN was formulated. The whole reason for UN was to, after World War II, was to make sure we never have another war. And that was the main reason, especially after the failure of the League of Nations. And but unfortunately, the winners of the World War II wanted to have some kind of a control. And so they came up with this idea of the veto power at the Social Security Council. And that, unfortunately, is the Achilles heel of United Nations, in that when you most need them, they're totally ineffective.
Yes, yes.
And that's the saddest part. And, yes. To the extent that we want to maintain some kind of sovereign state for each nation, rather than surrender our sovereignty in a kind of a federated form to have one world, where all nations kind of agree that we are all partners and neighbors and we join in one union. Yes. Until we can do that, we're always going to have these conflicts. So, but I'm not sure, how these structural issues and intellectual discussions and so on can solve this without bringing in these 3 Ds that you brought up.
Yes.
In today. And so somehow I constantly think that, we need to somehow create a mechanism by which these inner things become, embraced by the outer world.
Yes. I am with you.
That's the challenge, I guess.
I am with you in articulating this challenge, as you put it, in the way that you have done. And as you quite rightly pointed out, to the structural failure that is at the very heart of the UN Security Council with its veto power. So hopefully, Bharat, all I can say, Bharatji, is that, we just hope that when this thing ends, and hopefully sooner than later, the world will not simply move on, but will come back to this predicament and to try to find some way forward, or it will keep on happening. It will keep on happening, and we're already hearing echoes, of the possibility of this as a recurring international event. But I thank you for bringing it up. And this is the kind of wrestling and engagement that we need when we speak about fundamental human values.
Yes, well, I thank you very much, because I think this is very profound, and it's certainly helping me to create a lot of movement within me to think in terms of ways.
Yes,
like a student,
No, I appreciate everything that you said. I try to extend the implications of these values from mere interpersonal. I spoke about the resource, but then you are bringing it now and saying, how are these 3 values relevant in situations of international conflict and international? And I think it's so appropriate that we speak of that, even though we may not have an easy solution to this morning. But the very connection that you're trying to make, or the questions to probe, how can we retrieve these values and deploy them in some way or the other to serve us meaningfully in international context, I think is a very, very important way of reading these ancient conversations and asking appropriate questions. I commend that line of thinking. I'm very interested also in it.
Thank you.
So with that, I think it's almost noon. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much. Thank you for all of the comments, Shashi, Prasanna, Madhvi, Bharat, Naina. Thank you so much for being here and for adding to the richness of our discussion, and for all that we learn from each So let us conclude with that.
Thank you.
In the light of where we ended with Bharat's comments, important comments, let me conclude with the Shanti prayer, the peace prayer from Rigveda. Om Dhyau Shanti Antariksham Shanti Prithivim Shanti Apa Shanti Oshadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishvedeva Shanti Brahma Shanti Sarvam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Sama Shanti Redhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace in space. May there be peace in the atmosphere. May there be peace on earth. May there be peace in the waters, in the plants, in the forests, in the elements, in the Creator. May there be peace everywhere. Peace. Only peace. And may there be peace in our hearts.